Well, hello and welcome to another Monday night Q&A from the NIC, EIC and Alexa. I'm happy to say I'm joined tonight by another member of the field assessment team. It's area engineer Craig Hawkins. Hello Craig, how are you this evening?
Hello Sam, I'm very well, thank you. Yourself?
Yeah, good. Bit warm, but we shouldn't complain about that. But yeah, a bit muggy. Anything exciting today? Been out and about?
I was out and about down on the southeast coast today, so there was some nice weather across the channel. So it was a lovely day today.
Okay, all right. Well, without any further ado, we'll get straight into it. We'll just post out the question of the week that was put up on the Facebook and YouTube channels earlier today. So the question of the week was associated with generators. And it is, what is the recommended maximum impedance associated with an independent earth electrode providing the local earthing of the star point for an earthed generator? So a bit long-winded, but basically what's the recommended maximum impedance associated with an independent earth electrode that's providing the local earthing of the star point for an earthed generator? So where would we start with that, Craig?
So I spent a little bit of time looking through BS 7671 today, and there's actually no guidance in that standard in relation to this information. It's one of the sometimes many situations where the information can't be found in that standard, and we want to look outside of it, which is BS 7430. It is mentioned in Chapter 54, this particular standard of regulations on page 195, and again it gives us a title in Appendix 1, which is a code of practice for protective earthing of electrical installations. And it's in Section 7 of that particular standard, and it talks about 7.2 earthed generating sets. And 7.2.1 goes on to give guidance on this, and the value is... Have we got a question up before I give the answer too much?
Yep, let me just pose the... I'll put that... So yeah, absolutely. What was the answer in the spec?
20 ohms.
20 ohms, absolutely. And you're so right. It's one of those occasions which are perhaps more frequent than people realise, that we have to actually go outside of 7671 for specific guidance. 7671 gives us lots of information about the use of generators, but this specific one's actually covered in another British standard, 7430. So yeah, I've just popped up on the screen for those the actual statement within 7430 and that section. Okay, so a follow-up question that often comes then, so with the inclusion of the earth electrode with the generator, does that make it a TT earthing arrangement?
No. So the purpose of this earth electrode is to provide an earthing reference point on one side of the output of the generator, and this prevents it from being what we call a floating output, which causes fluctuations in the voltages on occasion, and the potential differences between that and the general mass of Earth. There are instances in 7430 which talk about floating systems, but that's generally with a generating set below 10 kilowatt.
Yeah, smaller. So yeah, and again, within that same standard 7430, it actually tells us that the purpose of this earth electrode isn't to provide an earth fault path. That's not its main purpose. If we look at it within that standard, it says that it's earth to limit the potential of the line conductors with respect to the general mass of Earth, particularly under fault or unbalanced conditions. So it really is to stop it being a floating generator and to pull it down for a couple of reasons. The main one being that now we've got a very low resistance between the earthing arrangement of the generator and true earth, so we're not going to introduce large potentials if users of the installation are in touch with both. So yeah, it's not creating a TT. So that then next question rolls in. If it's not a TT, what kind of earthing arrangement should we consider it?
That would be a TNS earthing arrangement, and this is incorporated through the coils of the generating set itself, and we would normally be looking at the protective measure of ADS in that circumstance.
Yeah, absolutely. So although there's an earth electrode, we have got an independent protective conductor provided on the output side of the generator, and because we've got that independent protective conductor, that would be our separate protective conductor, and so yeah, we would look to treat the generator in that earthed arranged instance as a TNS system. What about the value of 20 ohms? Where does that value come from?
So that's a generally accepted low enough resistance to minimise the potential differences between the output of the generator and the general mass of earth, as what you were saying earlier, Sam. It's typically we're designing the system so the earth impedance does not use the earth electrode, and it's predominantly being used in the TNS system of the generator. There are certain situations under fault conditions, insulation, failure of the supply cables that could be in contact with the general mass of earth, but these are very much a could and actually are very unlikely in most circumstances to happen, and it would be more likely that you have a fault on the equipment that you're using, which would then go down the protective conductor of the TNS system and the cables you're using, rather than being to the general mass of earth.
Yeah, absolutely. So although there is an earth electrode and there is the potential for that to create a path under certain fault conditions, that the system, as you say, is designed to protect us against earth faults at the items of equipment and accessories, etc., that we're supplying from the generator, which is where the fault path will include that protective conductor then, rather than the earth electrode. So again, then following on from that, what type of protective devices would we normally associate with the generator if we're using ADS as our protective measure?
Well, because of the output coils would typically have an earth loop impedance that is relatively large, it might not be a case that a fuse or a circuit breaker would be able to deal with the or have a sufficiently large enough fault current to operate the protective device. So we would possibly look at using RCDs and the provision of overcurrent protection through whichever means, fuses, MCBs and such, to provide overload protection. So the RCDs would generally be for fault, and then the MCBs or the fuses would be for overload protection. Yeah,
absolutely. And quite often those protective devices will be incorporated into the generator, so not always necessary to provide them separately. But yeah, it's one of those things that's why you've got to do a little bit of homework and research on what generator, if it's being supplied by others, or it's something to consider if you're the designer of the whole installation, to make sure that you've got those protective devices built in, or otherwise that you're going to have to supply them separately. So yeah, and this all came about, real life question to the technical helpline last week. It was actually it had another side, because they were actually using the generator to supply some camping pitches, so obviously perhaps not a permanent campsite, but perhaps something that was either just going to be run over the summer or had just recently been a pop-up type site. So rather than have a permanent supply instantly, they were going to do it with a generator. So yeah, real life example call that came into the helpline last Thursday. So interesting question, and we do get from time to time the generator questions, because it's not mainstream, and the biggest thing is a lot of people go down the route of thinking, okay, it's got an earth electrode, so therefore it must be TT, and in this instance it's not the case. Okay, so let's have a look in the chat room to see what questions are coming in, if any. So I can see the first one Is there any way of verification of a bonding conductor on a large installation when isolation of the supply is not possible on an EICR, or when adding or altering a circuit? Okay, so I guess there, if we're saying isolation is not possible, so we can't safely isolate and disconnect to do any disconnection of the bonding conductors to verify. So yeah, tricky one there. What were your thoughts? Get me words out in a minute. What would your first thoughts be on that one then, Craig? If we can't isolate, can we verify the bonding conductor on those large installations where perhaps it's not practical to turn off the whole supply?
So you can do a long lead, wander lead R2 test, but what you do have to consider with that is that you may be getting parallel paths through your wiring system that could be introducing a lower earth path to your MET. Then you would be looking at the bond size. So example of that might be a case of you've got a boiler connected to the electrical system, and the chassis of the boiler is earthed through the flex outlet plate or the fuse connection unit. So when you do a wander lead test, you would inevitably get quite a low resistance value there when you're trying to do it to the bond that might be attached to the chassis of the boiler, which wouldn't give you a true representation of actually the bond cable itself to the extraneous or likely extraneous conductive part. So it can be difficult. You can identify if there is continuity there, but you wouldn't necessarily be able to identify if that is being provided by the intended bonding conductor.
Yeah, you know, it's always a difficult one when you can't do your dead checks, but possibly, depending upon the installation and the hierarchy and how it's electrically separated, you might be able to isolate an area of plant, which would mean then you could do that part. So although you might not be able to disconnect bonding conductors right back at the origin, if for example you've got bonding to local distribution boards, and then the bonding conductor is taken back as part of the distribution circuit, then there's a possibility that way. But yeah, again, you need to have a good understanding of the layout and the hierarchy or topology, whichever way you want to say it, of the site to be able to ensure that it's safe. Otherwise, I guess ultimately it's going to result in a limitation, either agreed if it's something that your client or customer tells you about at the beginning that they can't switch off for whatever reasons, or it will be an operational limitation if it was something that you weren't aware of until you got on site and started the process. But yeah, interesting question. Another one that's come in the room, where are AFDDs meant to be used? Okay. At the moment within 18th edition, and the Amendment 1 didn't vary, it is just a recommendation where additional protection against fires caused by arcs are seen. There are some examples given of possibles, so it's things like where there's sleeping accommodation, where there's combustible structure, perhaps where there's items that are irreplaceable. So it is only a recommendation at the moment. And I think the other thing to say would be, well, a couple of things. Firstly, it is expected that it was one of the most highlighted, commented on sections of the document for public comment with regards to Amendment 2, because there were some proposals to enhance or increase the situations where AFDDs would be used. So we're all waiting with bated breath to see what the outcome of that document for public comment will be, and Amendment 2 will define. The other area I'd also mention is that our best practice guide that we use recommends that if AFDDs are not installed, then the only areas that we'd consider it is where you've got combustible construction material. So for example, barn conversions, where I believe it's recommended as a C3. I'll just check that, but I think that's the only type of instance. So it's where we've got a high degree of combustible construction within the building. While I just have a quick check of that, anything you'd add on that one, Craig?
Yeah, so that's regulation 421.1.7, which is on page 80 and continues on to page 81 of the Blue Regs book. It talks about premises with sleeping accommodation, and as Sam said, it is only a recommendation. Locations with a risk of fire due to the nature and processing of stored materials. And this includes woodworking shops, combustible material locations, and as Sam said, the combustible material of the building itself, such as a wooden building, fire propagating structures, which is where you have a structure itself which would propagate and make the fire worse, which for obvious reasons we would want to avoid, and locations where there is the engagement of irreplaceable goods. Yeah, they're the aspects in page 80 and 81 of 421.1.7.
Yeah, and I had a bit of a sweat on because I wasn't 100% sure. I had that doubt with the cameras running as normal, but thankfully I was right. So in general, lack of AFDDs we talk about as something worthy of note, but don't give it a classification code unless you're looking at an installation where we've got a strong use of combustible construction material, in particular then where there were dwellings. So for example, a residential resulting from a barn conversion would be a classic, where we've got a strong combustible material and we've got the possibility of sleeping accommodation. So those two things together, then we'd recommend a C3.
Yeah, there's a heightened fire risk that we have to be careful of, and making sure that we're protecting people against.
Yeah. Okay. So the questions are coming in now. Please do keep them coming in. Is it normal for lightning electrode conductors to be connected to the MET? And if a lighting electrode, if a lighting electrode are fitted, do you have to install type 1, 2 and 3 SPDs? So two-part question, good question. So first of all, is it normal for lightning electrode conductors to be connected to the MET?
So from memory, I think this might fall again outside of BSM 6.1 to some respect, and look at, I think it's BS 7909, off the top of my head. I'll have to double check that.
Yes, it's 909s for temporary supplies. There is a standard. There is a standard for lightning protection. It's an EN, starts with a 6, because it's actually treated as an extraneous conductive part. It could, if a lightning strike were to happen to the building, to the structure, that large voltage that's then conducted away through the lightning protection system could result in a flashover, because we're talking about such high voltages, to the electrical installation. And because of that fact, then yes, we do need to bond the lightning protection system to the MET. The sizing of it and the location of it should be determined by the lightning protection engineer, and covered under that British standard that escapes most of us now. But yeah, it should.
BSEN 62305.
62305. Brilliant. Okay. So yes, in answer to the first question, yes, it should be bonded, and it should be sized and the position of it located determined by the lightning protection engineer. The second part, and if a lightning electrodes are fitted, should we have installed type 1, 2 and 3? Well, yes, where we've got a lightning protection system, so that means obviously there's a high risk of lightning strike to the structure, to the building, then it's recommended that we have a type 1 SPD, which has got the high voltage withstand category. So yeah, and then depending upon how further into the installation you want to provide protection against those transient overvoltage would determine then whether you want 2s in further locations where there are distribution boards, for example, and 3s where you've got vulnerable equipment. Okay, Right. Very pleased to actually say, so remember, Craig, I spoke to you before that we had an open question from last week, so thank you to the person who's come back and said, Sam, any further information on the recommendations for CPD hours associated with EAS? Yes, we did go back, and it is something that we had on the book to talk about tonight. Okay, the way it is at the moment, we don't have a definitive hours minimum quotient. It is being discussed with the drivers for EAS and with all the other competent person scheme providers, so that there's no definitive answer at the moment. I think our guidance is it will come, but at the moment we just want to start to introduce the principle and get people recording the data. There will be guidance in the future of minimum counts, but there's nothing defined yet. So rather than me give you something to aim for at the moment, all I would suggest is obviously do as much as is relevant for your sector of the industry with regards how much it's changing, and what's relevant for your scope of work. So how wide do you do electrical installation and periodic inspection work across? But yeah, initially we want to get the principle across and get people starting to do the recording of the data, and that's both whether it's structured, so something like this, or whether it's unstructured, so it's you reading, so it doesn't have to be a formal training course. It could be something as simple as watching a video, reading a technical article. That they're all forms of CPD. And I mean, you must be seeing it out there, because Craig's one of the area engineers who's going out now talking to our registered contractors and our applicants about what's required. So yeah, would you add anything to that, Craig?
Yeah, so to the contractors that are on our schemes, we also have the webinars that are run on a Wednesday night as well, which are a really fantastic source of information. There are plenty of other technical articles, technical videos and knowledge-based technical discussions that are out there that you can read, watch, listen to, podcasts and such like that really get people understanding some of the changes and the increase in knowledge in our industry that we're looking for.
Yeah. So all I would say is thanks very much, but I can honestly tell you it was on the book to talk about tonight. Just keep an eye on us, and we will sort of be highlighting further information as we get closer to the EAS changes that are applicable in September. So yeah, at the moment we just want to get people familiar with the idea of formally recording it, because it may be something, we're well aware of. Lots of organisations already had toolbox talks as part of their processes and regimes, but they weren't formally recording it. So in a lot of instances, people just need to actually start recording what they're doing as evidence of continual professional development. And we do it as well. We have to do it internally, both for our own organisations and quite often where we're registered with third-party organisations, there's a requirement to provide CPD records to those as well. So thanks for the reminder. I know that's not a definitive answer that you perhaps want, but that's the way it is at the moment. That we don't want to tell you something now that we might have to change in 2 or 3 months' time. Okay, let's have a look. A bit thin on the ground for questions tonight. So if you have got any, and you've always thought we've not answered yours, you might be able to get your question in tonight. One of the earlier ones, not really technical, but as we haven't got a lot in there, we'll answer it. Why the domestic installer can't do EICRs? It's fairly simple. Domestic installer scheme is, as it says, for domestic installation work, really driven by the original requirements of Part P, and so it's a scheme that was focused on domestic installation work. So yeah, we're not saying that domestic installers aren't capable. What we're saying is we've never assessed domestic installers for EICRs. So if EICRs are something that you want to do, then there's two approaches. If it is in the private rented sector, then that's a separate scheme that we run, and there would be a separate assessment to enable you to be enrolled on that. Alternatively, there's the approved contractor scheme, which would enable you to do EICRs, again providing you present an EICR of the type of work that you would normally do, i.e. domestic or non-domestic, for assessment purposes. So yeah, there are routes for you to get in, but as standard, a lot of people just do domestic installation work and they don't want to do EICRs, so it's not something that they want added to the domestic installer scheme. Anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, the domestic installer scheme is tailored, or the assessment is tailored around the assessment of domestic installations, be it very small installations or very large domestic installs. We generally don't assess or comment on condition reports on those type of assessments.
There's a great question in which I wish I knew the answer to, and I'm sure you can imagine is it coming home? Oh my God! If we've got time at the end, we'll talk about that. But yeah, that's probably tonight's best question. Yeah, it'll be very interesting. Very interesting. What recommended reading is there on generators? It's a good question, because we talked about BS 7430 has got a great section on generators, but it's an expensive standard. We tend to find that a lot of the supporting standards that we often need from time to time, depending on our scope of work, things like the fire alarm standards, the emergency lighting standards, are actually more expensive than BS 7671, and that's really just a British standard cost thing. They obviously sell a lot of BS 7671s, which means they can reduce the price on those. So even though those other standards are smaller in content, much smaller, they tend to be more expensive because they're not so popular, and there isn't such a large abundance of sales. So yeah, it's a little bit of a catch-22. They're expensive because they don't sell many. They don't sell many because they're expensive. It's a difficult one. So yeah, we have. In the past, we've produced articles, and perhaps we'll post out on social media a list of the few articles that we've done on generators from time to time, because not a lot has changed in that world. Sometimes the threshold of when we need to earth things change, because the network operators also have a say in some of the requirements for earthing generators, especially when we're using them as in parallel with the network operator's supply. So yeah, perhaps that's one thing we'll do is just create a little list of the back articles that we've produced on generators, because most of them will still be relevant to current day. Okay, let's have a look. Do switch fuse isolator fall under the requirements of similar switchgear for domestic installations regarding non-combustible consumer units? What's your thoughts on that, Craig?
Yes, I think interestingly, BS 761 doesn't really justify the term similar switchgear, but it would be a location where there is a possibility of loose connections or poor maintenance over time, which in previous years has possibly caused the plastic consumer units or the combustible consumer units to cause slight issue. So I'm sure Sam will correct me if I'm wrong here, but I would say that the switch fuses would fall under a similar vein as the consumer units. But if I'm wrong, I'm sure Sam will correct me on that one.
Yeah, I think because that particular reg goes on to say, and similar switchgear assemblies shall comply with BSEN 61439-3. So you'll tend to find that most standard isolators won't fall under that standard, and so our view is that if they don't, and because of the situation that Craig mentioned, once we've got an isolator in, we're far less likely to go in, make changes, make additions to it, because there's no possibility. So the likelihood of creating a hazard is far less. Similarly with the, if you think about it, the meters, all of the equipment on the supply side of the consumer unit tends to be of combustible material, and it's seen because that's perceived as less of a risk. So yeah, in general, we would suggest that because those standard single pole isolators are built to a different standard, we wouldn't see them as warranting the same degree of protection. So yeah, we would say that they wouldn't have to have a non-combustible enclosure. Let's have a look. So I got this question wrong. I need a 20 ohm rule. Okay, so yeah, link those articles. Okay, we will definitely try that. Are there any specific checklists for EICRs where PV is present? It's a very interesting question, because there isn't really. I mean, there's a small section at the end of the EICR which asks you to consider other special locations, but yeah, and we know with a PV installation there are some particular requirements, such as we need isolation on the AC and the DC side. So there are some specific requirements, but no, it's a good point, because there's nothing specific. But I guess again that just boils down to, these are generic forms, and if we had a form that covered every eventuality, we're talking about a lot of pages. So yeah, rightly or wrongly, but I can appreciate that we perhaps a lot of people would benefit from having some additional information around solar PV, but that really comes back to the competency question. So should you be looking at EICRs for PV if you haven't got that familiarity with PV installations? No would be the answer. So yeah, I do agree with you. There isn't any, there's not a little drop down section within the EICR scheduled inspections for PV. There is just that reminder that says, have you got any other special locations? And then hopefully that reminder will sort of go you to look at, okay, I just need to have a quick review of that special location section to see if there are any particular requirements. Would you add anything to that?
No, I think I'd agree with you, Sam. It's making sure that if we had to include all of the special locations in a form of tick sheet across our EICRs or our EICs for that matter as well, we'd be looking at pages and pages and pages of tick sheets that we, for most cases, probably wouldn't be relevant for every install. So, and the changes that would undertake on amendments and changes to the regulations would be quite costly to the IT and BSI.
Yeah. Okay, we're vastly running out of time again, but there's a few questions coming, so we'll try and answer these, especially as we asked for questions when they were slow at the beginning. So, first one. Why do fans require a 3 amp fuse in the UK only, and what are they doing elsewhere that warrants not using a fuse? So this is it's a common topic of conversation when we've got the bathroom fan fed from typically the lighting circuit, which is typically protected by a 6 amp breaker, and then the manufacturer requires the fan to be fused down to 3 amps. My take on it is that generally we find we can emit overload protection when we know the load is a fixed load and it's never going to pull more than its design current because it physically can't, the structure of it is. When it comes to fans, we have to think they are motors. There is a motor there, and if the fan does jam through foreign object or through simply just dirt and build up on the fan mechanism, then that can result in it jamming and trying to pull more current. So we can't go down the route of that reg which lets us emit overload protection when we've got a fixed load, providing we've got fault protection. So that's often the reason why. And then, again, if manufacturers specify it, then one of our fundamental principles says we need to consider manufacturers' instructions. That would be the question. Well, why ask them? And if it is because of that case that they need independent overload protection for the internal workings and the internal safety of the fan, then we need to fit them. But I think in general that's the reason, because we can't consider the motor as a fixed load. Would you agree with that, Craig?
Yes, definitely. And it's not all manufacturers that are warranting the 3 amp protections. Some are and some aren't. You'd have to check with not only the manufacturer, but obviously the individual piece of equipment itself that you're installing. And as you say, Sam, we're looking at the overload of the fan itself, and if a 6 amp MCB cannot offer the overload protection for the internal wiring of the fan, then we'd be looking at providing the manufacturer's recommended size elsewhere.
Yeah. Okay, we'll take one more. Does an outside meter cabinet fall under the definition of an enclosure? Can only be opened by a key, because many contractors code visible basic insulation as C2 on an EICR, despite, and I think then you might have run out of characters. So does a meter cabinet fall under the definition of an enclosure? Yes, it does. It's not normally owned by the building or installation owner. It's normally owned by the meter or energy provider, but it is considered an enclosure. And then our suggestion would be, so long as it's a fit for purpose enclosure and provides the right degree of barrier and enclosure protection, then we would suggest that single insulated conductors within that enclosure wouldn't provide a shock risk to the users of the installation. We would see it as an enclosure. Would you agree with that, Craig?
Yeah, all we do have to consider is the ease of access, but then again, it is an enclosure. It is only accessible through the use of a key or a tool.
Some great questions coming in now, so I do promise I will keep them for next time, but we'll greatly overrun again. So we'll just finish with this one. To maintain the integrity of a non-combustible enclosure, do I need to fit fire-rated cable glands where cables enter a domestic consumer unit?
So 421.1.201 has no specific requirement for this. It talks about the consumer unit itself, but we do have to look at the manufacturer's instructions and the good workmanship that we apply to limit the openings where the fire could escape from. So we're looking at making sure that section 416.2 is complied with in relation to the IP ratings of the consumer unit, top, front, sides, and so on. But checking the manufacturer's instructions to ensure that you're keeping the integrity of that consumer unit free from fire escaping from the enclosure.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, there's nothing in 7671 that says we have to use fire rated glands and we have to seal openings. It was more about the construction of the consumer unit itself, which often resulted in molten plastic dripping onto combustible material and spreading the fire that way. So obviously we wouldn't get the same issues with openings, so we're not talking about the spread that way. So yeah, there's no requirement. That's not to say you can't do it, there's no problem with doing it, but there's no specific requirement in 7671. Okay, I've got to say, I feel guilty now about asking people to ask questions because they've flurried in, but I can guarantee you we will hoover them up and start with them next week. So I really do appreciate it. We'll draw a veil over it tonight. I just want to make you aware there is no webinar this Wednesday. Perhaps fortunately, because as some people have said in the chat tonight, there is a small football match going on at Wednesday night at exactly the same time as a wire webinar, obviously trying to compete with us for an audience. So there is no wire webinar this week. The next one is a week on Wednesday, that's the 14th of July, and it will be another one in the EICR coding clinic. This is the 9th one, so another good one. So if you have got any interesting photographs and any interesting situations you'd like us to consider for coding, then please send them to us via the social media channels. Once again, thank you very much for the questions, and I will hoover those ones up that we haven't. We've got some. I think it might have been the same person who asked the question telling us it is coming home, trust me. So I'm pleased we'll end on that, because that's a great high to end on. Thanks very much, Craig. Enjoy that again. Fastest half hour of your life.
Yeah, I love these. These are really enjoyable. I enjoy these.
It is. It's good. Hey, we all know that when we get, you get two electricians in a room, that's enough people to keep the conversation going for a whole evening. So, when we get 30, 40, 50, 60, we could definitely go. So thank you very much. Cheers, Craig, and cheers, stay safe.
Thanks everyone else.
Thanks to everybody, and we'll see you again next Monday. Don't forget, if you haven't already registered for that webinar on the 14th, please go to the NICIC website and do that. Okay, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks everyone.